From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I want to thank you all for coming on a weekday. I know it's not easy. It also happens to be St. Patrick's Day. I have the green to go with it. And as you see, green is something that's also celebrated by other more ancient cultures, if you like. Sprouts and spring is in the air, and for the Persian-speaking communities and world, Nowruz is here. It's a very important holiday, festive occasion that goes back to ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Near East, something I would like to highlight, especially since in the media we're seeing the destruction of such wonderful sites in the region right now. I wanted to mention a word or two about the great cultures of ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Persia, Sumeria, Babylonia, Assyria, the Parthians, the Sasanians, Achaemenid Persia itself, and of course Nowruz, which really ties in with the Zoroastrian tradition of the Persian Empire. It is a culture that has survived all this long, and today it has also become a regional holiday that is celebrated not just by Persian speakers and people who speak Iranian languages, but also various Turkic peoples, all the way from the Uyghurs of China to the Balkans, Azeris, and including Turkey, consider Nowruz an important holiday for them. It brings people together. I want to thank you for coming to the library. We are continuing our lecture series that we had started last year with the help of University of Maryland. The inauguration was last year at the time of the Persian book exhibit, 1,000 Years of the Persian Book. This year we have about 6 lectures coming. The first one you're about to see. We have 2 very distinguished scholars here who will be introduced shortly. And it was done in conjunction with the support and the collaboration of University of Maryland's Roshan Institute for Persian Studies. Dr. Kara Mustafa and Fatemeh Keshavarz are here from University of Maryland. We are very glad that they're here to help us open this year's series, which focuses on philosophy. There will be about 6 lectures this year, and every year, hopefully from here on, we will focus on different themes. We're also lucky this year because we happen to have a new head of the Near East section who is also the Turkish world specialist. Joan Weeks, who just joined us, is a very appropriate person to have come introduce our speakers and speak on behalf of the division. Unfortunately, our chief, Mary Jane Deeb, could not be here. She had a little bit of a health emergency, and she apologizes for her absence. Joan, if you would take a second, it's quite befitting that the Iranian and Turkic sections are opening on this wonderful Nowruz event together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Harad. And on behalf of my colleagues, and in particular Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the Division, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the African and Middle East Division of the Library of Congress, and especially to this Persian book lecture series with our special focus here in 2015 on philosophy in Persia. First, before we get started, we always like to give you a brief overview of the division and the resources in the hopes that you'll come back and use our collections in this beautiful reading room. The division is comprised of 3 sections, and we cover 75 countries around the world and 24 languages. And the African section includes all the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. The Hebraic section covers Judaica, Hebraica worldwide. And the Near East section covers the Arab countries, including North Africa, Turkey, Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, the Muslims in Western China, Russia, the Balkans, and the peoples of the Caucasus. Can you imagine trying to travel through all those regions? Well, we embed those collections here in the African Middle East section. Today's lecture continues this collaborative lecture series on the Persian book that was inaugurated last Nowruz. at the opening of the exhibit, of the Persian book exhibit. And our partner, Dr. Fatemi Keshnetwaris at the Roshan Institute, has graciously joined us to open this year's lecture series. And I'd like to invite her now to give us just a few words about this collaborative effort between us and the University of Maryland.
Thank you, everybody. I'm not going to take very long. I know you're waiting to hear from our scholars. It is really a great pleasure to be here and to be working with the library and to kind of reopen this series, which we put together over a year ago when we, Hirad, Mary Jane, Chris, and the team at the library and the Roshan Institute decided on having that exhibit on 1,000 years of the Persian book. It was a great exhibit. It brought close to 1 million people to the library, and we had the series that really brought all of you in the middle of the week here to listen to great speakers. So when the library approached us and said, could we do it again? We said, of course. That would be wonderful. So it's a great pleasure and honor for Roshan Institute to be again a part of this wonderful effort with the library, and particularly that our first two speakers, Professor Nasr and Professor Aminrazavi, very well known to all of you, though I'm sure they will be introduced again. It's a pleasure to have you to be the opening speakers for this program, and I won't say any more except for look forward to another year of really bringing together a galaxy of stars. Thank you so much.
Well, today we are very fortunate to have with us the illustrious authors of From Zoroaster to Umar Khayyam. Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr from George Washington University and Dr. Mehdi Aminrazavi from the University of Mary Washington. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Nasr, and my colleague Hirad Dinavari will introduce Dr. Razavi at the conclusion of Dr. Nasr's remarks. Dr. Nasr is currently University Professor of Islamic Studies at the George Washington University here in Washington, D.C., and is one of the most important and foremost scholars of Islamic, religious, and comparative studies in the world today. He's a prolific author of over 50 books and 500 articles, which have been translated into major Islamic, European, Asian languages, and is a much sought-after speaker at academic conferences, seminars, as well as on radio and television programs. Professor Nasr was born in Tehran into a family of distinguished scholars and physicians. He began his illustrious teaching career in 1955 when he was a doctoral student at Harvard University. He's taught generations of students for over the years from 1958 when he was a professor at Tehran University, and since the Iranian Revolution in 1979 at Temple University in Philadelphia until 1984. Then at the George Washington University since 1984 to the present day. Professor Nasr speaks and writes with great authority on a wide variety of subjects ranging from philosophy, religion, spirituality, to music, art, literature, architecture, science, the natural environment, and is truly a scholar of the highest caliber. Please help me welcome Professor Nasr.
We start with the Persian poem. به نام آنکه جان را به نام که او را جان برافروخت چراغ دل به نور جان برافروخت. Let me begin reading a Persian with a poem with mentioning God, who is the source of all knowledge for us and all existence. I want to recount for you something which is of some historical interest. I had a very famous professor at Harvard, Professor George Sarton, who used to say that in the field of scholarship, a lot of things begin, but very few things finish. That's happened oftentimes for those who know major scholarly works. And I really thank God that this was an exception. It's taken 37 years for this 5-volume anthology of philosophy in Persia to see the light of day, what we are celebrating today. And I need to say a word about its history. In the 1970s, when I was living in Tehran, I was chosen as a member of the Institute International de Philosophie, which is in Paris, which is the most important academy, philosophical academy in the world, and which always has less than 100 members. So to become its member was a very great honor. And people like Gadamer, Paul Ricoeur, Habermas, all of these people like that, the most famous European philosophers, are its members. I was the first Persian and the first Muslim to become a member. So it was published in the newspapers, and it caught the attention of both the Queen and the Shah, and I was praised in Iran for having had this honor for the country and so forth. The head of the institute was Raymond Klibanski, very famous German scholar who resided in Canada, the only person I know who could deliver a lecture in Latin, who could speak Latin, who could say, make a steak for me, well done in Latin, which no Latin scholar in Washington can do. I'm sure they could quote Latin verses, but he was an unbelievable Latin scholar. He came to Iran, and he went to see the Queen, and it was a reason for the foundation, really, of the Imperial Iran Academy of Philosophy, which I founded in 1972, and was its first president, and it was the only institution of the pre-revolutionary period of Iran which still survives. The only cultural institution survives as it was, which is, makes me very happy. It's been going on for 50 years. The center of philosophical activity in Iran, which itself has always been a major center of philosophical activity globally. Klibanski then proposed, about 1974 or 5, that in Paris, with the help of UNESCO, we have chosen a few civilizations, and there were very few in the world, which have had a continuous philosophical history for millennia. And there are really no more than 3, China, India, and Iran, and Persia. Greek philosophy had nothing to do with medieval Greek philosophy, nor that with modern Greek philosophy. It's called Greek philosophy, a very, very different thing. These are these 3 countries, but we are going to include Greece anyway. So we're going to have 4 volumes devoted to these 4 civilizations. And now that the Imperial Academy is founded in Iran, please do the one in Iran. I said, all right. In my weaker moments, I said, I never say no. That's my great tragedy in life. I know many languages, but I do not know the word no in any of them. So I said, all right, I'll do it. I'll do it. I said, all right. And so I began the preliminary work, and then the revolution came along. Everything was totally destroyed. All the work I'd done, my library was confiscated. I don't know what happened to it, and all my notes and so forth. So I didn't know what happened. But Klibanski wouldn't let go. He said, you had promised this to me, you must do it. So in a very, very difficult life that I had after the revolution, commuting between Boston and Philadelphia, professor of Temple, also teaching at Harvard, it was a very difficult period of my life. I decided I would do this no matter what. But I said to Klibanski, now that I'm going to do it, I do not want it to be only a 1-volume, 500-page affair, as originally was planned, and UNESCO had planned. I'm going to do a real anthology. And it's going to cover from Zoroaster to the end of the Qajar period, beginning of the Pahlavi period, the 20th century. And he accepted. They accepted, but they kept writing every day, where is it, where is it? So I started all alone. I was then teaching at Temple University, all alone, trying to plan for each volume, what to include, what to exclude. You can imagine a civilization that's had a history of 2,500 years, how difficult that task is. Because the task of inclusion is as difficult as the task of exclusion. They're both very, very difficult. You have too much richness to be able to just pick up a few things and publish it. You have too many writers, too many texts, and unfortunately, when you have knowledge of those texts, you cannot ignore them, and I happen to know something about these things. Anyway, to cut the story short, I worked on this for a couple of years by myself, until my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Mehdi Aminrazavi, became my student at Temple University. He did his PhD with me in Islamic philosophy. And he didn't know what he was getting into. When he got close to the end of his PhD, I said, look, I have a little project for you. Why don't you help me as my co-editor with this immense volume? And I said to him, quite rightly, I said, this is the Persepolis of Persian philosophy. We have the 8-volume work by Pope, which Reza Shah commissioned in 1938, which I have here in the library, on Persian art, survey of Persian art, which later on the Japanese did in 16 volumes. Incredible work, which no Islamic country has except Iran. Unbelievable work, survey of Persian art. We have 2 or 3 very good anthologies of Persian poetry, including that of Zabiullah Safa, Le Guirlande de l'Iran, which was done in France, and so forth and so on. But we have nothing on philosophy. All Persians are philosophers, but they talk through their head most of the time. The philosophical tradition is not easily available. So this is a major event. Please help. And he didn't dare say no, of course. I wouldn't have given him his PhD. He had no choice. So I accepted, and all those white hairs you see on that head are my fault. He worked for 30 years with me, assiduously. I cannot imagine. There are no more than 30 people in the world who have both the knowledge of philosophy and the linguistic ability to translate philosophical texts from Persian and Arabic into English. This is not a novel, and it's not a newspaper article. There are no more than 30 people in all over the world who really have the knowledge to be able to do this. So we had a very difficult task. And what I did, I decided to have a 5-volume work, a major work that would stand the test of time. I'm sure nobody will be stupid enough like myself to come along and do this again. So it will last for a long, long time. And I told him this is going to be a lasting work. It's not just a 1-volume Routledge thing we're doing. 10 years later, somebody else will come and do another Routledge series on Greek philosophy or something like that. So with the humble knowledge that I had of Islamic and also pre-Islamic philosophy, I made all the selections. Sometimes I consulted with him, sometimes I consulted with other scholars, but 90% I'm responsible myself for what was included. That was the first step. And then to have a 500-page book, so I will do page 136 to 182. It was not ad hoc. We didn't close our eyes and open the Divan of Hafez and read a poem. We decided what pages even in these volumes had to be done, but was central. It's a very, very difficult thing to have an anthology. If you want to know what is central to Avicenna's thought in the Shifa, which is 30 volumes, where do you go? What do you do? It's not an easy matter. So the little humble knowledge I had of Islamic philosophy, I've studied for decades and decades in both the West and Iran, I put to the service. I'm consulting with other professors. I know almost every single scholar in the world who knows something about Islamic philosophy. Occasionally we invite them to translate. Anyway, a very, very arduous task. And the first volume covers from the Bundahish and the beginning of the Zoroastrian period through the early Islamic period of Khayyam, as the last philosopher included in volume 1, and therefore includes both the pre-Islamic and Islamic period. There's both a continuity and discontinuity in the Persian culture and every field, including philosophy, but there's also great continuity. Persia remained in the Islamic period the center of Islamic philosophy, and it still remains today. More than any other Islamic country, the interest in philosophy in Iran, even the Islamic Republic, cannot be compared to any Islamic country. Any work of even atheists like Richard Rorty, who died, he was invited to Iran. It was read, and he was invited to Iran, an atheist giving a lecture to 4,000 people at Tehran University. You could not imagine that. The interest, philosophical interest is very, very great in Iran. And so thank God we were able to get help as much as we could. Sometimes we had to get manuscripts. I cannot go to Iran myself yet. I hope, inshallah, to go. I've not been there for 35 years for reasons that my friends know. Dr. Aminrazavi would go regularly and would even consult with scholars there, find manuscripts there. And thank God the first volume came out through Oxford University Press. Oxford said, we've been created for this, please give it to us. And they did a terrible editing job. I was not happy with it. I gave them the second volume. The second volume had 200 mistakes in it, so I broke the contract with them. I said, I'm not going to give you. And so we decided to do it again. At that time, the Ismaili Institute in London had just been established. And Agha Khan is a very good friend of mine. He was once my student at Harvard in the 1950s, and I've been in very close relation with him. I'm not Ismaili, I'm 12 Ethna-Ashari Shiite like most Persians, but I know little about Ismailism also. And so he had given orders that he was very philosophically minded. Anything Dr. Nasr wants to do, please publish it. So they got in contact with me. With IB Taurus, which is an English publisher but run by Persian, by an Iranian whom I do not know, but Dr. Aminrazavi knows him. They contacted us and we signed a contract, a major event, and they redid volume 1 and volume 2, and then the next 3 volumes took another 2 decades to come out. And thank God, the last volume came out a few months ago, and I'm really astounded. I thought I would die before this thing ever came out. Dr. Aminrazavi much younger than I, but I'm glad to be alive and to see the light of day. Just let me say something about the content of this volume, and I shall cease talking. Philosophy in the English language has a more extensive meaning than the same word from Greek rendered into Arabic or Persian, like falsafa. For example, in America, they have kind of the philosophy of tennis. There's a book called Philosophy of Tennis. Since I was a tennis player for a long time, I read the book. But you don't have a book in Persian called Falsafe Tennis. Philosophy is a discipline which is distinct from the sciences and from many other disciplines. And it's like physics. In Persian, when it is classical Persian usage or Arabic usage, the word falsafa is like physics. It's not like philosophy, which is vague. You can be a philosopher of the cooking in the kitchen and this kind of thing. Philosophy is an exact discipline. Now, at the same time, philosophy in the Western sense exists in our civilization and other disciplines. For example, Sufism. Sufism later on developed a vast philosophical structure from the time of Saruddin Ghunavi and Ibn Arabi and people like that, and it's what we would call mystical philosophy. The sciences, physics, mathematics, the treatises like Ikhwan al-Safa and the philosophy of mathematics, these are all scientific works, but the philosophical dimension. And in literature, so what would we cut the line? We wanted to be as scholarly as possible. Where could we cut the line? I've explained this in my introduction. I've written a major introduction to every volume, an introduction to every section of every volume. As for introduction to individual scholars, Dr. Aminrazavi and I have divided them. Some he's written some, I've written some. But if you look at those major introductions to each volume, I've explained that I do not want to take the time of the audience. But we have not been exhaustive in the sense of including everything that is philosophical in Persian culture, obviously. But we have tried to be all-inclusive in what concerns falsafa. And those which are closest to it, that is philosophical theology and philosophical mysticism, philosophical kalam and philosophical tasawwuf. And there are many renditions, many translations. Now, the Persians wrote both in English, not some of them write in English, one of them is standing in front of you. But they wrote in Arabic and Persian both in the Islamic period. In fact, the Persians, the lamps in the old mosque of Cairo were so much more reliable. But now we're in this modern technology, you rub the magical sign and something comes up and then it goes off again. Anyway, it dropped my train of thought, but that's all right. Let me start again. The philosophical writings are both in Persian and Arabic, and the Persians wrote more philosophical Arabic than the Arabs did, much more. In the sense, percentage-wise also, the Indo-Pakistanis wrote more philosophical works in Persian than the Persians themselves. Not number, but percentage-wise. That's a very interesting statistics about the Islamic world, which very few people in the West know. But anyway, Arabic was a major language, is a major philosophical language, even in our own day. My own teacher, Allama Tabatabai, wrote Bidayatul Hikmah first in Arabic. It was after his death that it was translated into English, despite the tremendous revival of the Persian language as a philosophical language. First in the hands of Ibn Sina and Nasr Khosrow, and a little decline later on in the hands of Sohrawardi, another decline later on in the Qajar period. Despite that, Arabic remains a very, very important central philosophical language, and so we had to have recourse to both people who know Arabic and people who know Persian. I don't want to take too much time. I just want to conclude, because this scholarly assembly here, with how we went about doing this. First of all, we do not claim that this is the only anthology that could ever be produced. Can anyone claim that this is the only church that could ever be built or a mosque that could ever be built? No. No. Other people will come along. I hope that they produce 10 anthologies. An anthology always reflects, of course, the views of the person who's the editor, what is going to choose or she is going to choose. So we do not claim finality, but what we do claim is comprehensiveness and knowledge of the different schools involved. I've been studying Islamic philosophy for over 50 years. I've taught it for 20 years at Tehran University, 30 years here, 5 years at Temple, at Harvard, this place, that place. I know a little bit about Islamic philosophy. And there's some schools that I like more than others, some philosophers I like more than others. We try to be evenly balanced. I have a great deal of love for Ibn Sina, Sohrawardi, and Mullah Sadra. I've written most of my writings on these three men. But the anthology is not only on these three men. We try to be evenly keeled and try to present an objective view. Secondly, we had to choose who were the important philosophers. And that meant not only in themselves, but also in their influence, or vice versa. Fame is not the only factor. Some philosophers become very famous, but they don't have the substance as much as philosophers do not become famous. We have that in our own day, and we've had that in every period of history. Thirdly, availability. There are many major works of Persian thought that are lost, or we couldn't find the manuscripts, or we found one, let's say, Library X, and they will refuse to give it to us. So the question of feasibility, practicality was also there. We did not limit ourselves only to manuscripts or to already translated works. We used a few translated works, which I revised somewhat, but we relied on both published texts and manuscripts from all of the Islamic world, especially from Turkey and Iran, and sometimes from Egypt. Fifthly, we tried to create a vocabulary, which would be very difficult because we had different translators, which would bring some homogeneity to the 5-volume work. This is over 2,500 pages. Some of the world's greatest scholars are translators. And when you become a famous scholar, you insist that Sabzi has to be translated this, and somebody else translates something else. So no, you know how picayunish scholars are, and we had a lot of trouble with this. So I did not uniformize completely. It was not right because they did not agree, and the translations were good. They were also great scholars, and I didn't want to be dictatorial. But what we have done is, with their own permission, to homogenize the vocabulary as much as possible so that you feel you're dealing with a single tradition. The very first word, the most important word of Islamic philosophy, of any philosophy, being. We have being, existence, being with a capital B, existence with a small e, and a capital E. You have 4 different possibilities. Each of these has a different meaning. And something as simple as the existence of God. I never use such an expression. Because God is above existence, because existence already has the X in it at the beginning, which means to come out of. And comes from the Latin existere, which means to pull out of the ground of being. So the famous book of Hans Kung, Existiert Gott, does God exist? You could say, believe in God and say, no, God doesn't exist, He's the source of existence. So we had very, very major philosophical discussion and problems into which I will not go because I cannot presume that everybody is a philosopher. But alhamdulillah, thank be to God, these problems were solved. You cannot imagine how much work it entailed, just the page proofing. And I want to end with a little bit of a joke. Dr. Aminrazavi is a wonderful colleague, but being a very great philosopher, he's very bad in proofreading. I'm not a very great philosopher, I'm a humble philosopher, and I'm very good in proofreading. I catch every single mistake. He would correct 10 times. I would look at it 1 second, I would find 12 mistakes that the U had become a W and so forth. And he was saying, like, I'm a philosopher, I'm not supposed to do this. I said, well, I'll do it since I'm not a philosopher, I'm just a secretary, I'll do it myself. But it's a very difficult thing if I have a person who's a thinker to have the sharp eye for details. Corbin had it, Henri Corbin, my friend in France. He was an unbelievably good proofreader. But usually people who do proofreading don't have patience for thinking about universal abstract ideas and vice versa. So we had this little problem between us, but he did so much hard work. I forgive him for the few typos that he missed, which I had to correct myself. But both he and I went over every page, all of the 2,500 pages. The bibliographies are all I prepared myself and then gave it to him, and he would add a few, and then would add the details from, place of publication and things like that. And we both learned a lot also. We have to be humble. We learned a lot in the process. Let me conclude by, first of all, thanking Dr. Aminrazavi for all his collaboration during all these decades. Secondly, all the scholars from all over the world, which includes some of the major names in both Islamic philosophy and medieval philosophy in general, European and Islamic both. And thirdly, of course, the publishers who did a yeoman service and did a very good job, the editors in London. I will not name their names, I don't know who they are, but IB Tauris and the Ismaili Institute both for having made this possible. And finally, most of all, I thank God, without whom, of course, such a thing would not have been a possibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seyyed Hossein Nasr. That was a wonderful introduction and how the book was put together. Very useful for us, especially librarians. I'm going to take a minute and introduce our second speaker. Dr. Mehdi Aminrazavi is a professor of philosophy and religion, is a co-director of the Ledecker Center for Asian Studies, and he earned his PhD in '89 in philosophy of religion from Temple University. And he received his MA in philosophy in '79 and a BA in urban planning as well from University of Washington. A native of Iran, Dr. Aminrazavi has published in both Persian and English and translated from Persian and Arabic into English. He has received a number of awards in the United States and internationally, and is a member of the American Academy of Religion, the American Philosophical Association, and the Middle Eastern Society for America. A member of the editorial board of the Journal of Religious Studies, Cambridge, England. He is the author and editor of numerous books and articles, among which are The Islamic Intellectual Tradition in Persia, 1996, Philosophy and Religion and the Question of Intolerance, 1997, Sohrevardi and the School of Illumination, 1997, The Wine of Wisdom, 2005, which we had him come and give a book signing on that book, which was on Omar Khayyam, The Islamic Philosophy and Theology, and an online textbook for colleges. It's a textbook produced in 2010. He is a co-editor of the 5-volume set, An Anthology of Philosophy in Persia, and the anthology was recognized as one of the superior books in the field of humanities in the 23rd Annual Tehran International Book Fair. So without taking much more time, I'm asking you to please come and give your presentation, and again, thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by also a Persian poem. به نام آنکه او نامی ندارد به هر نامی که خوانیشو سر برآرد. I'd like to thank first and foremost the Library of Congress. It was about 30 years ago which this project began right here. I've spent countless number of hours on the second floor of the other building, Adams Building, I believe, that, at the time, and lots of time here, wherever Mr. Pourhadi is. I'm grateful to him for allowing me access to all sorts of documents. Without the Library of Congress and its extensive resources, this project would not have been possible. Also, I'd like to thank Mrs. Wicks and Mr. Dinavari out there. I didn't see you, for organizing this event. Dr. Nasr has covered most of the issues that are pertinent and important to this project, so I'll keep my remarks as brief as possible. On the logistical side, it was a Herculean task, really, not only to find the manuscripts, to find the most of whom were not in critical editions, and so translation and doing sort of semi-critical editing became part of our job as well. Working with well over 30 translators throughout the world, from Japan to Tehran, from United States and Canada, was also a very, very major endeavor. And of course, as you all know, great projects can't simply be made or come to their fruition. There has to be money. And fundraising was a major, major problem, which is perhaps why it took as long as it did. But in either case, the project is almost finished. Dr. Nasr is asking me to do a 6-volume and bring the volume all the way to the contemporary period, a task which, of course, I'm willing to do. I can't say no to Dr. Nasr. So, one of the intellectual underlying reasons, or several intellectual underlying reasons for doing this project for me personally, was first and foremost the fact that the contribution, philosophical and intellectual contribution of Iranian philosophers generally had become part of various cultures. And by that I mean the Persian world, the Persian-speaking world, Persianite world. It has been expanding and contracting throughout history, and our philosophers generally at one time were Persians, and another time they became part of a different nation, and so on and so forth. And also other, because of the Orientalists' encounter with the Arabic tradition, Arabic intellectual tradition, many of the Muslim philosophers, the Persian philosophers, came to be known as Arab philosophers. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not using that as in the negative sense of the word, but generally the continuity of Persian philosophical tradition was by and large ignored. So that was one of the important tasks that I very much like to have brought to surface. The second one was that for some odd reason, Western scholars of Islamic philosophical tradition in general, and even Iranians themselves, would consider Islamic philosophy to have ended somewhere. As far as Western scholars are concerned, Islamic philosophy came to an end with Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and after that Muslim philosophers simply stopped thinking philosophically. There is no such thing as Islamic philosophy after that. And furthermore, Islamic philosophy in the western part of the Islamic world more or less ceased to exist. It is only in Persia, the greater Persia, that we see this vibrant and living tradition to continue. And so one of my great interests was post-Abyssinian tradition. There has been a good bit of scholarship with regard to the earlier period, Farabi, Avicenna, and so on, and Ibn Rushd as well, Averroes. But most of the philosophers in the post-Abyssinian period, which is 1,000 years of philosophical tradition after Avicenna, was almost unknown to the West. And even in Iran, if you ask someone who is Ibn Turki, Isfahani, or someone like that, they wouldn't know. So one of our attempts was to introduce the significance, the presence and significance of post-Abyssinian philosophy and that 1,000-year-old tradition, thanks God, came to fruition as well. The third element, which is important for me, is the ecumenical or, let's say, comparative philosophy. As far as comparative philosophy is concerned, Islamic philosophy, for some reason, is perceived to be only a medieval tradition, and it can enter into dialogue with Western medieval philosophy, but not modern philosophy. As it turns out, and as Professor Nasr rightly alluded to this, I learned this, that much of what Muslim philosophers wrote, especially with regard to the question of existence, essence, some of the ethical theories, are not only pertinent as far as the contemporary world is concerned, but they can be a very healthy dialogue and exchange of ideas between Islamic philosophy and modern Western philosophy. This is one of the things that has been lacking, and so we brought it to its fruition. And so the 5 volumes has taken 30 years, each one 6 years or so. As Professor Nasr mentioned, under his supervision, this work became possible. There are countless number of nuances and problems and issues related to this project, which I won't go into it. I know we have to stop at 1. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to cut my remarks a bit short and allow for 10-15 minutes of question and answer. Is that okay? Yeah. Sure, that would be fine. I do have a funny story to tell you now that I have a few more minutes. 23 years ago, I was sitting on the 2nd floor of Adams Building. It was 4 o'clock, and I was doing research on the Anthology. My wife was expecting at that time our son, and so I called her about 3:30. Those were the days when we didn't have cell phone. I used the pay phone and put a quarter in it and called her and said, is everything okay? Should I stay or come home? And she said, no, stay and do your work. So I stayed, and by the time I finished my work at 5 o'clock and went home, my wife was gone. There was a note on the table and said, I'm in the hospital, come. And so I measured the length of this project with my children. The first one, when the first one was born, who was 28 years old and is sitting there, I was working on an Anthology, and the second one, it was the same. And so what is particularly significant for me is not only the richness of this collection, but also the contribution that Library of Congress has made in terms of making its rich resources available. Hopefully there will be a 6th volume in which we will bring the philosophical tradition in Persia up to the present time. It will be a very complex project to construct for all sorts of reasons, but inshallah, in due course, you will see a 6th volume added to the existing 5 volumes.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions. I also want to bring your attention to the book signing back there. Volumes 1 and 2 of the book are available. It was impossible for the bookstore to get all 5 volumes here. Feel free to get the books, and the authors will go ahead and sign. I will start with one question for both of them, and I'm curious to see, because they have a little bit of a difference in worldview, I'm curious to see how each of them grapple with this. This philosophy that we are talking about, especially the period that starts from the 9th, 10th century, from the Salmanid period on till the 12th century, many scholars see it as Islamic. What specifically separates it as specifically Persian, متمایز میکنه این را به عنوان یک فلسفه ایرانی versus an Islamic philosophical tradition, especially since, as the professor mentioned, most of these Persian philosophers from the greater Persian-speaking areas actually wrote in Arabic themselves. So the works a lot of times tend to be in Arabic. And also many of the Indians who actually wrote in later centuries chose to write in Persian. However, many of the Persian speakers themselves used Arabic. So this interplay of language, I'm curious to see how the different professors approach this question. Thank you. Befam.
This is a very important question that he has posed. I never use the word Iranian philosophy, as the Arabs use Arabic philosophy. When I have lecture in Cairo, I do not use that. I believe that Islamic philosophy is Islamic philosophy because it's based and related to the worldview of Islam. And Hindu philosophy is Hindu because it's based on the worldview of Hinduism. And Buddhist philosophy is Buddhist because it's based on the worldview of Buddhism. However, there are two different categories. You can be both a Catholic and a Frenchman. You can call 13th century Catholic philosophy, which was in France, French philosophy. You can also call it Catholic philosophy. One is a nationalistic, ethnic appellation. The other one has to do with the worldview on religion and the philosophical outlook. The two are not contradictory to each other, which is what modern nationalism has done. Modern nationalism has shattered the unity of the Islamic world. And I'm one of the people who stood against it ever since I was a young man. So, yes, Ibn Sina is an Islamic philosopher, at the same time is a Persian philosopher. It's like saying you can be, as I said, both an American and a Catholic. Oh, but isn't this contradictory? No, you can be both. And it's the polarization that has been created in the minds of modernists between being a Catholic and an American. It has not been created in that sense. I'm using that as an example. But in the East, which has brought about this dichotomy, which is, I think, nonsensical. It's total nonsense. And I never use it. I believe it's false. And then also you have these intermediate situations. Farabi's mother was Turkish, his father was Persian. We have to have a blood test to see which was more strong. So you can say, was it Turkish philosopher or Persian philosopher? You cannot imagine the nonsense that the Turks and the Iranians and the Arabs have written about this. You just cannot imagine the nonsense that has gone on. And of course, it began with the misuse of Orientalist study of Islamic philosophy, and it was done on purpose. In the conference that was held in 1909 in Paris, the parliaments and others, to try to Arabize Islamic civilization, the origin of Arab nationalism begins there, not with the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party issued from that. It was a European plan to nationalize the Arab world, to break the unity of the Islamic world. If you study modern Islamic thought, you will come to that. It's not a time to go into that. But this is a very, very important question. And I do not believe that the worldview that I hold and many people like myself hold has any contradictions. I'm a Persian. I'm proud to be a Persian. I've done more for Persian philosophy than anyone in the world in the 20th century, but nevertheless I call it Islamic philosophy because that's what it is, most of it. I don't call it Bundahish Islamic philosophy. And I do not think we should go overboard, be chauvinistic and nationalistic, and try to be scholars at the same time. It doesn't work.
I tend to agree with Professor Nasr, of course, with regard to the fact that Islamic philosophy is Islamic philosophy, especially in the earlier period. So we have had and have no nationalistic agenda, so to speak, which is why we did not call this an anthology of Persian philosophy. It's an anthology of philosophy in Persia. And that makes a major, major difference.
Yes.
Having said that, again, it is a learning process for me at least, as I sift through these materials, especially after Avicenna, you get a distinct feeling that if philosophy were to be wine of wisdom, and Persia is the goblet within which this wine is poured, clearly the wine becomes the shape of the goblet. And so Persia, with its intellectual, historical, intricacies does come into, in my humble opinion, of course, Professor Nasr is my mentor and teacher, but does come into the picture, especially after Sohrawardi. When we looked at pre-Islamic philosophy, I reviewed maybe about 2,000 pages of Manichaean and Zoroastrian materials, the emphasis on light, the emphasis on illumination, the emphasis on all sorts of things which comes into Sohrawardi and the School of Illumination, and the mystical, what should we call it, texture of philosophical thinking in Persia does give it a quote-unquote Persian texture that is not to be mistaken with nationalism. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Folks, feel free to ask questions. The family, go ahead.
There's a gentleman in the back.
First you, and then you in the back. First, go ahead.
I think as Professor Nasr pointed out, philosophy continues to be very popular in Iran. People like Habermas and Rorty visited, and thousands of people show up and so forth. The question I have is prior to the contemporary period, but in the closer, let's say, post-Mulla period, what are the philosophers who write in that part of the world? Who are they in conversation with? Are they writing with, are they speaking to their earlier philosophers, or are they, how aware are they of other philosophical thinking around them and in kind of conversation?
چی مثل نفهمیدم سوالش چی بود؟
صحبتی که دارن میکنن در اون دوران میخوایم
I didn't quite.
میگم مثلا افرادی مثل هابرماس و اینها که با فلاسفه ایرانی در دیالوگ هستن با چه بخشی از فلسفه؟
Actually, my question is, whether the later period philosophers of Iran, the post-Mulla philosophers who wrote in Iran, who are they in conversation with? Are they writing commentary on earlier philosophers? Are they aware of each other?
Yeah, well, that's a very complicated question. We have several categories of philosophers in Iran. Let's have the last 50 years. That's what you're asking. You're interested in the modern period, right?
In the last couple of centuries, actually.
Oh, last couple of centuries.
Yeah, post-Mulla.
Well, until the 20th, until really Aqali Modarres wrote Bada'il al-Hakam in the time of Nasruddin Shah, which was a response to 8 questions that were brought from Western philosophy, mostly Kant and Descartes, by Ottoman Sultanate to Iran. Before that, the Persian philosophers, Islamic philosophers of Iran, were all writing actually in the context of the tradition within which they lived. They had nothing to do with European philosophy. They knew nothing about European philosophy, nor were they interested at first in European philosophy. When Descartes as ideas first came to Iran, they thought it was childish. Nobody paid attention to it. It was Comte de Gobineau, who was ambassador of France to Iran, who happened to be a philosopher, the founder of a philosophical school called Gobineauism, which is very famous because of the racist philosophy that some people thought played a role in the rise of a Nazi movement in the 20th century. But he was not a Nazi. You should not accuse him. He was very much interested in Persian philosophy, and he also translated some French philosophy into Persian. From then on, gradually, some Iranians began to become interested in European philosophy. And this reached a crescendo after the constitutional revolution at the end of the Qajar period, and especially during the time of Reza Shah. When Tehran University was founded, of course, the earlier faculties of medicine and law had been in the Dar al-Funun. They go back to the Qajar period. But the other departments belong to the Pahlavi period. They were founded in 1934. And the established Department of Philosophy at Tehran University for the first time, where I was professor for 20 years. It was completely on the basis of European philosophy. I was the dean of the faculty of Tehran University for years. It's I who finally broke the ice and had our students study some of their own philosophy. All the philosophers were trained in Europe. They had Habermas of that day was having a dialogue with himself, except his smaller self. And Iranians, like Indians and Japanese, they're all third-rate European philosophers. I'm very, very critical of this because I've been at the middle of this battle for a long, long time. In 1958, when I returned from Harvard, I wrote a little essay, which was like a bomb within Iran. Because out here I had somebody coming from Harvard who knows English and French better than most Iranians do. It's not just from the bazaar of Tehran. And I wrote a very, very critical essay against simply gobbling up and imitating Western philosophy. And from that time on, things began to change somewhat. And during the time of Muhammad Reza Shah, you gradually began to get a number of people who wanted to be rooted in Islamic philosophy, but also speak to the West. So there are three types of people in Iran for the last 50 years. One is the traditional philosophers, like Ashtani, Sayyid Ashtani, Ayatollah Khomeini himself before he became a political figure. People like that. Allama Tabatabai. They were deeply rooted in the Islamic philosophical tradition, and they didn't have discourse with Habar Masas. Allama Tabatabai was the only exception because
I mean, somebody like Mullah Sadra, I mean, who were they in conversation with?
they were talking about the issues which were raised by people like Mullah Sadra, which are universal issues, and some of the issues in their own society. But not what Habermas was saying about those issues. That was not of interest to them. That's the first group. The second group were a small group of people, but mostly my friends and students, like Dariush Shaigan, people like that who studied for years with me, who were interested in Islamic philosophy, but also knew something of Western philosophy and wanted to carry a dialogue like myself. I know Habermas is a personal friend. We also have dialogues together with Paul Ricoeur. I know almost all the Blaval, I know almost all the famous European philosophers the last 30, 40 years. The third group were a group of people who were completely westernized in the philosophy. They had Persian names, but their ideas were as if they were a PhD student from Sorbonne, from the University of Rome, from the University of London. And they're the ones who are mostly going to Europe and participating in these conferences and so forth. So what the Europeans were hearing, not only from Persian, but from Egyptians and others, was themselves, the echo of it. Second-rate version of themselves. And it's that which I stood against very, very strongly. And all these three strands still continue, and the great paradox, which nobody in this room really knows, is that with the coming of the Iranian Revolution, where we expected Islamic philosophy to suddenly be on the rise. The founder of the revolution was a major Islamic philosopher. He had taught the Asfar of Mullah Sadra for decades, Ayatollah Khomeini. That suddenly things went the other way. And the situation today in Qom, the center of Shiism, is much worse from the point of Islamic philosophy than it was when Ayatollah Burujerdi was there and Allama Tabatabai was teaching Islamic philosophy there. The last bastion of authentic Islamic philosophy is the Institute of Philosophy, which I founded in Tehran, which my own very fine student, Dr. Ghulam Reza Avani, ran for 20 years, which is now the most important center of traditional Islamic philosophy in the country. It's a catastrophe from my point of view. You have all the young mullahs who are writing about Wittgenstein. It's become very fashionable. Not the way I had in mind, that our philosophers have to learn Western philosophy and be able to confront it. But there's one thing to confront, one thing is to be devoured by the whale. And that's the second that has usually taken place.
Next question, the other person in the back, the family. Go ahead.
Don't ask Dr. Nasr, you see me all the time. Ask Aminrazavi. He's one of my students, so he doesn't.
Come closer.
Come closer.
Speak up.
Muhammad, come closer. Nobody hears you. Pick up. Here, in Shunkura, he's a young Lebanese scholar who's doing his PhD at American University and is very much interested in Islamic philosophy and Islamic studies. Go ahead.
All right. My question is for the two of you. The contemporary world today, influenced by Western academia and the mainstream scholarship, is under the influence of different schools of thoughts and theories in philosophy, modernism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, or so on and so forth. Now,
Ask your question.
my question is, what are, I mean, do you think that Muslim scholars today are still capable of producing an independent or parallel or alternative sort of epistemology, and what kind of issues that they can address or they should address based on the tradition we have from like traditional Muslim philosophy?
I definitely believe they can, and so this has been done to some extent. not only in Iran, but in Pakistan and other places, in Malaysia and Indonesia, much less in the Arab world. He's from the Arab world, which one would think is the center of Islamic civilization, but intellectually it's a colony of something else, of Arab nationalism for the moment. There's very little first-rate Islamic thought coming out of the Arab world right now. Let's hope it will change and will come out. But most of the serious Islamic thought is coming out of Iran. Turkey, you'll be surprised, the secularized Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Malaysia, these 5 countries. There are a few good thinkers in Egypt, but too few. But just let me finish. I don't think we have time for any more questions. It's 1 o'clock. But since you addressed that, the condition, however, Mr. Hossein, is that they be rooted authentically in their own tradition. I believe that this be the case, Islamic thinkers can challenge every Western idea, not only metaphysics and philosophy in its pure sense, but social ideas, economic ideas, the environment, everything else. One example of it is what I've been reading for 50 years about the environment. Who first discovered there's going to be an environmental crisis? 6 months before Lynn White, right in this very building, gave his talk on the historical roots of our ecological crisis, which everybody thinks is the beginning of the environmental movement. 6 months before that, I gave the Rockefeller Series lecture at the University of Chicago on the issue of man and nature, the spiritual crisis of modern man, which was the first work to predict the coming of the environmental crisis. How did I do it? By applying our own principles to the situation which I happened to see. Because I'd studied science for many years at MIT and physics and mathematics and so forth, I know little about these things also. I applied it, and there it was. And I think we can do this. There's no reason why we cannot do it. And despite all of the third-rate, 10th-rate thinking that's going on in the Islamic world, there are some very good signs. There are some very good islands here and there. And I'm very far from being hopeless. I think we should pay attention more to those countries that I mentioned and what's going on there intellectually. Inshallah, much better things will come out of Egypt and Syria and Iraq and these major Arab countries that have been rocked in one way or another, and they're not in a normal intellectual condition now. But for the moment, I think it's the rest of the Islamic world, especially those countries I mentioned, where the loci of the major intellectual activities of the day.
One last question.
Can I just add a comment? Yes. Just to respond to your question a little bit more specifically, there has already been several philosophers, contemporary philosophers, like the late Mehdi Yazdi, who has done some comparative work in epistemology. Dr. Muwahid in Iran is a logician, and he has done a good deal of work working or responding to paradoxes with Quine and so on and so forth. So in certain areas, Islamic philosophy can and should respond to the West. And in certain areas, it neither can nor is it necessary, in my humble opinion.
Thank you. One last question. Go ahead.
I'm not a philosopher.
Could you, why don't you come and speak here so everybody can hear you?
My professional training is exact sciences, not in philosophy. But all I know is that, at least in the West, Zoroaster is considered the father of philosophy. What is the role of pre-Islamic Iran in philosophy in Persia?
There were pre-Islamic Iran.
Yeah. Because Zoroaster was considered...
All right. The question is asking, what is the role of pre-Islamic Iran in the rise of philosophy during the Islamic period? It's a very, very important question. There are certain extreme nationalists in Iran who say in all the streets of Hamadan there were Ibn Sinas running around, but the Arabs came and burned all the manuscripts, and so nothing was left. This is a totally absurd historical account. If you had had Ibn Sinas during the Sassanid period, we would have heard of them. In the same way we've heard of Buzar Jumeir, or we've heard of musicians like Barbat and other great figures of the Sassanid period. What happened was that in the Sassanid period, philosophy in Persia was embedded still in religion. That is, Persia was an Asian civilization, exactly like India. People talk about Indian philosophy all the time, so famous. But where is Indian philosophy? Indian philosophy is in the commentary on the Upanishads, on the Manvantaras, on other ideas that come from Hindu sacred texts. There was no Indian philosophy. In the Samkhya and things like that were always integrated into the Hindu religion. The separation of philosophy from religion occurred with the Greeks for the first time. And it occurred after Pythagoras, and you know that Plato was against this. In the book of Laws, he writes about this, but it occurred, and it ended with the death of Greek civilization, the death of Greek religion, and philosophy claiming to play a kind of religious role or something independent of religion. This was unique to the Greek experience. No Asian civilization had ever experienced this. And the Sassanid civilization of Iran, what you ask about, belonged to that category, that is pre-Islamic.
I'm not talking about the Sasanians.
That's pre-Islamic.
Yeah, I'm talking about Zoroaster. Zoroaster in the West is considered as the...
What are you talking about then?
زرتشت خودش میگن به عنوان فیلسوف.
Oh, Zarathustra himself. I thought you meant the Zoroastrianism. Oh, Zoroaster was known in the West as both a magician and a philosopher. If you want to know how the West look upon Zoroaster, listen to the Magic Flute of Mozart, Zarastro. As that's how the common European understanding was of Zoroaster. And there are many books even on magic in Latin attributed to Zoroaster, which are not by him at all. Very complex image developed of him. But Zoroaster was a prophet. He was neither a magician nor a philosopher in the ordinary sense. Of course, we would consider Parmenides or Plato to be also prophets in a certain sense. That's another issue. But in the ordinary sense of philosopher, he was not a philosopher, but he came to be known in the West mostly as a philosopher, not in Persia itself. He was never given the title of philosopher or hakim even. He was a prophet who stands above both philosoph and hakim. It's in the West that this idea developed paradoxically. And a lot of the study was, why did this happen? Why did this happen? People think it's probably through Mithraic texts and all kinds of things. I'm not a specialist in pre-Islamic Iran. I never make comments on something which I'm not supposed to be a specialist, so I don't want to give a definitive view. But it did happen. The image of Zoroaster in the West, in the late Roman Empire, and the beginning of the Middle Ages, is very different from the Zoroaster that we have in Sassanid or Achaemenid Iran. That's all I can say.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.